So welcome to the journey. It's going to be fascinating to see if we can do this. You know, it's a busy world out there. There's a lot of stuff happening. And when we take this inside-out approach, the potential is huge to make a positive difference. You know, there's so much to say about it. First of all, my condolences for the family and for the teacher who was killed. And, you know, the small part that I looked at was that the people who knew the young, the adolescent, I guess he was 14, who has been arrested, said that they didn't detect anything in him that would make them worry, which of course makes us all worry. So I would like to know more about that. You know, when you look at the essence of adolescence, the emotional spark, the social engagement, the novelty seeking, the creative exploration, nothing in that is about murdering somebody. So because the adolescent period is a time when you get the onset of psychiatric disturbances, of all sorts, probably because of this pruning that goes on, where a vulnerable individual, for either genetic reasons or experiential reasons from family life or genes or a combination of the two, you know, has the adolescent pruning going around. With stress, that pruning can become worse. You can get the release of regulating behavior and the release of anger and all sorts of things that can explain, unfortunately, stuff like that can happen with a psychiatric disturbance. I mean, just take, for example, John Lennon. When John Lennon was murdered, it was from someone who had a psychiatric disturbance. So there are times, sadly, in our world where there are guns available that, although actually that wasn't even the gun, was it? Yeah. So, you know, sadly we live with these horrible, horrible things that happen, you know, and I don't know if the school is going to examine its own community and see if there was anything that could be done. Sadly, sometimes there's nothing that can be done to prevent something like that. I mean, I'll just say that. So we need to see how it all unfolds. Just to give you a comparative example, a dear friend of mine had a situation where a relative was in a school where the person had a psychiatric meltdown in college in a dorm, and instead of the dorm realizing this person was in trouble and they could have detected it, they just isolated this person, isolated him. This is an adolescent, you know, 19, isolated him, and then ultimately a terrible tragedy happened that could have been prevented if the community had taken responsibility for the members of the community. That's not always the case. There are sometimes people that are not even being bullied, there's nothing happening, and there's just disturbances, sadly, in the mind, and these terrible things can happen. So, you know, in terms of what you can do as a school, the community needs to get together and people need to talk about the feelings about what happened, of course, and be open about that and how scary it is and how vulnerable people feel. Finding a way to really make sure everyone talks about their feelings is the most important thing. Because now, basically, your school community, the whole world, but the people close to this teacher, you know, will be in a state of grief. And grief is not it's not a problem to be solved, it's an emotion to be experienced. And that's really an important way to recognize it so that people don't have to feel ashamed of the terrible feelings of helplessness, you know, thinking I should have protected her, I should have known, I was with him in my class, why didn't I know he was going to murder her? You know, these are things that sometimes cannot be known. And letting people release the guilt they may feel and having the school reflect on that. And that's totally different if we were to hear and I don't know about it, you can tell us. If the school said, well, this kid was being bullied and no one was doing anything about it and he was screaming out of control and said he was going to kill people and everyone ignored it, that's like a completely different thing. And that does happen, like with my friend's child. But you know, if it hasn't happened, we just need to know that's a part of, sadly, being human, is that there can be very disturbed people and you don't see it. Those kids, especially who are close to that boy, to talking about it, the whole school talking about it, and just letting it be named. You know, I have this phrase, you know, name it to tame it. You know, you name it grief, you talk about vulnerability, you talk about helplessness, and you know, like anything in life, you know, obviously if we could prevent that, that's the best thing. sometimes you can't prevent things. So then when things are as they are, the mindful approach, if you will, the way to really be with it is to see some of these crises, you don't want to make them happen. When they've happened, you actually can find the opportunity to deepen a learning for all those kids, to make them aware of their emotional state, to teach them how to support each other, to acknowledge when grief has happened, and to do something perhaps in her name, to honor her, if they feel there's something that will be helpful for her family and for the school. Things like that can be very helpful, but not to be quiet about it, and to own the painful parts. And if it has to be in a private counseling session for those kids to say, I should have known on the soccer thing, he said he was mad at me for kicking the ball at his shin, and I should have known that meant he was going to kill his teacher. I mean, even if that doesn't make sense, someone may be feeling that. And listen, here's the thing. Like, for example, for me, when John Lennon was killed, even though I was 3,000 miles away, I kept on going over and over and over in my head, why didn't Lennon do this? Why didn't Lennon do that? Why did he have to stop outside of his house? Why couldn't he drive into the house and get a sandwich? Why did he say, it's okay, I'll get out of the car, and then the guy shot him? So when we feel helpless, we go over and over and over and over and over, and our cortex does this, and feeling of helplessness. And so that's just something to name. And it's a part of, sadly, growing up in the world is being open to that feeling. And still being able to have joy in life and moving forward through your grief, but realizing, this is just what it means to be human, and it's what an adolescent can struggle with. It would be much harder for a younger person to embrace that, but it's important to have that conversation. Very important not to, as you know, not to make a hero out of the person who died, because sadly there's this thing called contagion. You all know about that, right? Where you make a hero out of a suicide completer, and other people will commit suicide because they look at that hero status and they feel, well, I feel so empty right now, I'd rather be a hero and be dead than be empty and be alive. And then other people kill themselves. So we've learned a lot about not making those people into heroes, just for the sake of the living. And so talking about feelings of despair. Suicide is a very serious risk during adolescence in general, and finding a way to get people just in touch with what that feeling is like of helplessness. And it isn't even depression so much as what my teacher who started the American Suicide Prevention Service, Ed Schneidman, would call psych ache. You ache so much and you feel no relief. You feel so helpless that you think suicide is actually going to solve that problem, not even realizing how much pain it would cause everyone in its wake, but you just feel so much pain. So having people realize they can get relief from that pain is the crucial thing to do. A couple of things to say about that. Number one, please come to a conference that I participate in called Wisdom 2.0. It's in February around Valentine's Day every year in San Francisco. And we bring all the Silicon Valley people who run all those things that are doing all those things, and they're there. Those people are actually there on the stage, and they're there at meal times and stuff like that. And so we try to have exactly that conversation. And so I'm there to engage them in all this stuff, and I do work with a lot of those companies trying to really get them involved that way. And I know my colleagues up at UC Berkeley, they're also working with them exactly like that. How do we create more compassion, all this stuff? So we're really trying, and I gotta say, those folks are completely into mindfulness. Thich Nhat Hanh was just at Google, running around with everybody. I just gave a talk at Google. Facebook is having all sorts of great things happen at. So I'm very hopeful, knowing the individuals who run those programs, that they're really excited to work with you and these general concepts. So please come to the meeting. The second thing to say is that we have to be careful about conclusions about it. I once taught in Australia, and I said, yeah, social media doesn't really involve nonverbal signals much, and I'm really concerned. And someone had just completed a study of 100,000 adolescents, and she showed that, in fact, for her study, that social media increased face-to-face time for 80% of the adolescents, but for 20% of them who had social challenges, like anxiety, social phobias, or were on the autistic spectrum stuff, it was much harder for them. So we have to be really specific about the question, like, how does social media affect different groups? and how can we try to make it promote more empathy and compassion. I completely agree with you. First of all, middle school kids that from what parents experience and from what teachers talk about and what you may remember from being that age, it's so full of change in your body starting puberty that there's just feelings of being uncomfortable and unfamiliar and irritable, and the lower parts of the brain that respond to facial expressions, for example, are much more likely to interpret neutral faces as hostile. And so there's a lot more of that brainstem responsiveness. So teaching kids at that age mindfulness would be a really good thing to do. Teaching them, for example, the wheel of awareness practice, where they can feel something arising and not necessarily have to react to it. That's the buffer between an impulse and an action that I'll bet you if we did a systematic study, maybe through the Harvard Brain Mind Education Program, we could actually show that this would improve things. I work at the Garrison Institute in New York, and we actually have a program funded by the National Education something. And basically what we teach teachers to be more mindful so that they can actually encourage their kids in middle school, for example, to have that kind of presence. But it's a hard time. You know, when your body is changing like that, it feels really new and awkward and uncomfortable, and you don't know exactly how to respond. And so being open to that and encouraging them to become more aware is a good way to go. Culture is basically just relationships and the communication we have and the ideas we spread around. So when we talk, for example, about making these ideas a part of cultural evolution, it's absolutely the way we've been evolving as human beings is by cultural evolution, not so much by genetic evolution in the last definitely few hundred years, but even thousands of years. So this is a really important issue. How many of you who are adolescents right now in the room feel pressure academically on what's going on with you? Raise your hand. Let's see. So you can see it's most people are raising their hands. And you know, my kids just went through the high school thing and one just finished college. The sad thing is if you look at the research, and the parents are probably going to be mad at me for saying this, but the research really shows is that if your adolescent is focused on what they're doing and passionate about what they're doing and pursues that with a lot of gusto, but keeps themselves healthy in the face of that without overly getting stressed out, they're actually going to do well no matter what school they go to, and that what college they go to has absolutely nothing to do with anything that happens in their life. How much money they will make, how successful they will be in their careers, their social relationships, or their happiness. Zero. Zero. So, you know, the crucial thing is literally getting in touch with this essence, your emotional spark, your social engagement, your novelty seeking, your creative explorations. It doesn't mean you just don't do anything. It means you engage in something passionately. So the great news about that study, is we need to take a deep breath and say, do your best, work hard, devote yourself to your studies, but have some perspective about it. Now, here's what I think is going on. We live in a time when, in our modern culture, we are getting exposed to so much stuff. Literally, the bits of information you get streaming into your brain is more than ever before in history. Even in the last 5 years, how much increase there's been. So we feel this incredible sense of being overwhelmed, number one. Number two, the world is changing faster than it's ever changed. And when I've reviewed this with historians, they say, this is not just a feeling like, oh, things are changing faster, we just feel that way. No, they really are. The world is much more interconnected than it's ever been, and things are shifting, and things are hugely uncertain. And so when you look at this uncertainty, you've got to have a process, for example, that the mindfulness program here at Middlesex teaches, or Inward Bound Mindfulness Education would teach, this way to actually create a space in your mind. I do it with something called the Wheel of Awareness, where tonight you can all go home and go to my website, drdansiegel.com, and click on the Everyday Mindsight practices, and do the breath practice and try the Wheel of Awareness practice. And what we do, literally, if you think about this wheel, there's an outer rim and an inner hub, and the hub is this sense of knowing, a spacious knowing, and the rim is anything can be known. So in this case, what you would do is you would say, I feel on my rim unbelievable pressure to get a good SAT score. And instead of being lost on the rim, you've developed this capacity to be in the hub, where you go, I see what that pressure is. So you don't just deny it, you acknowledge there's a pressure there. But then I realized, I heard in this talk, that it actually, my college I go to and the SAT score I get actually predict nothing. I don't know if you know that. The SAT score you get has nothing to do with even how well you do in school. It's amazing. So you go, okay, well that's another point in the rim. And then you go to another point in the rim which says, hey, I think I'm going to study well, but I'm going to relax. I'm going to have a perspective. These mindfulness kinds of practices, a way of literally integrating consciousness is what I call it. It gives you this capacity to be flexible. Now, with all of the applause about the research study, the good news is that if you as parents feel this way, why are we still worried about it? Well, I think what's happening is this. In an uncertain world, the mind really wants to grab onto something that's certain. So if I can say, well, if I get this GPA and I get this SAT score, I will probably get into this college. That college, if I name drop it at a school function, will probably get more looks of, oh, your kid goes to blah, blah, blah. And I got to tell you, I don't know how it is on the East Coast versus the West Coast, because this is true on the West Coast too. But when I went to school, people were saying like, well, do you like surfing or do you like skateboarding? Not like, are you at this school or that school? I mean, it was a weird thing in LA. Maybe it's an anomaly. But this idea of certainty is really what we're struggling for. I have a lot of kids in my practice who were pressured to get good grades, and they got from California, got into fancy schools out here. They come back to continue their therapy, and I'm going to tell you this honestly, and they would want me to tell you this. They feel completely empty and completely burnt out. They have no idea who they are, and they're busy, still running the rat race, racing for nowhere, which is the name of a great film, The Race to Nowhere. And this is the whole idea, like, why? It's this sort of cultural delusion. Delusion is something not consistent with reality, that if I grab something certain, like I got this degree from this place, everything is fine. No, actually that isn't fine. It's just an illusion you went after because you wanted a feeling of certainty. Well, if you let it go, and you let your son or daughter find what truly matters to them, they will pursue that with a gusto and a passion. It will be their own, and they will create the kind of world we need, which is where people really feel strongly about what they're doing and come with an authentic sense of self. That's what mindfulness can give us. That's what literally changing the cultural conversation is all about. At the end of the Brainstorm book, what I do is I say this. I say, look, there are two ways the self is created. The self is created by knowing what your body is feeling, what you're passionate about, but the self is also created in connection. And so it's both a me and it's a we. And I used to say from me to we a lot, and people would say, well, from me to we sounds like you're giving up me and just going to we, and I want to have my me, and I don't want to have just a we. And so then I made up this word called mwe, M-W-E. So I said, if you live life as a mwe, then you get it all. Because then you can savor the world and also serve the world. And this is basically how the book concludes. All the studies of well-being show that when you're actually doing things in service for other people, you get this deep sense of well-being. So think about if that were really what we were competing with. Not with each other to try to get better SAT scores or better grades or better colleges or whatever that means, but actually, what if we were competing with the world's problems? And so you have a competitive streak, good. Let's figure out how to stop making the climate boil over. Let's try to figure out how to feed people on the planet. Let's try to how to make this place a healthier world. Let's try to help people get along better. Those are things we can compete with. So if you like to get out on the field and play lacrosse or soccer, whatever you like to do, great. Let's pick an enemy that if we defeat that enemy, everybody wins. That's what we can do. That's a shift in the cultural conversation, right? And that's something we engage in. And it isn't like we say to adolescents or ourselves as adults, you've got to change the world or you've got to improve the world. No, that's too big an issue. All you have to say is we need to serve the world. And at the same time we're serving it, because that you can be in control of, you can be certain of that, you also can savor the world and keep on enjoying it. There's a wonderful poet named Gary Schneider who is a poet, has been writing for years about our planet. And he says this beautiful thing. He says, don't try to save this planet out of guilt. Save this planet out of love, because you love the earth. And that's what we can do. And that's literally creating the love around things. And that love is like candlelight, you know? When you have a candle that's lit and another candle comes to you that's unlit, and you light that candle, and now you have two candles, what happens to the light of the first one? It doesn't diminish. It doesn't diminish. This is the kind of world we need to create. There's something called sympathetic joy, which doesn't exist much in the world. What sympathetic joy is when you see someone succeed, you get really excited for them. When you see someone happy, you're really happy for them. Think about if we could make sympathetic joy a part of our planet. Everything would turn around. Instead of trying to rip people down, we'd try to put people up. And there's no reason we can't do that. We can do that. We really can. And that's the kind of world we can create. Thank you. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.